Another day, another banger. This week's movie franchise recap will be of the series Yellowstone. Enjoy the recap. Yellowstone begins with a bleeding John Dutton talking to his horse and shooting it before walking away and placing his cowboy hat on. A massive accident seems to have taken place, and the police arrive on scene. Back in the state of Montana, we see Jamie Dutton, the son of John Dutton, arguing in a courtroom fighting for his ranch, but is disappointed with the result. Meanwhile, Casey Dutton, another son, is discussing business when we get to also meet Beth, the daughter of John. In a meeting, she is the voice of the family and with her strong character decides to threaten a man there, telling him she's going to become CEO and that there is nothing he can do about it. In the meantime, Casey arrives home and is greeted by his son and wife. Soon enough, he releases a wild horse to try and tame it when his brother-in-law greets him. Back at the Yellowstone ranch, Jamie and John talk while he stitches him up. Soon enough, another one of John's kids named Lee arrives just as John enters his chopper and takes off. Across the expansive field, a lively celebration unfolds. Amidst the festivity, Senator Huntington and Thomas Rainwater, a tribal leader of the Native Indians, are engaged in a crucial meeting. Rainwater passionately explains his plans to the senator, revealing his intention to reclaim all their lands for the benefit of his people. Concurrently, Dan Jenkins, another influential figure, is in the midst of a meeting of his own, outlining his ambitious strategy to power the town, which involves commandeering a river. In a nearby bar, Beth is enjoying a drink when a man approaches, attempting to engage her in conversation and figure her out. Demonstrating her strong and assertive nature, Beth quickly shuts him down and exits the bar. Back on the ranch, tensions rise as cowboys confront the Indian tribe. The situation escalates when Robert Long draws his weapon, prompting Lee Dutton to swiftly correct him and de-escalate the situation. John Dutton arrives shortly after, assessing the tense scene and conversing with one of the tribal leaders. He informs the leader that Thomas Rainwater does not approve of the current methods being employed. John then instructs Lee to disperse the men, allowing him to attend a livestock auction. At the auction, John slips into the back to speak with Jamie, but their conversation is interrupted by Dirk, who presses John for a favor. Before John can respond, Governor Linnell arrives, joining him for a discussion about the new tribal chief, Thomas Rainwater. After a brief exchange, she departs, leaving John to ponder the complexities of the situation. In the meantime, back at John's house, Beth warmly greets her dad, informing him about the events of her day. The next morning, John departs early, heading out for a drive. Meanwhile, Casey is busy trying to tame a wild horse when he receives an unexpected visit from his father. His father sternly advises him not to side against him with the Native Indians, reminding him that Casey's wife, Monica Dutton, is part of their tribe. He then expresses a desire to see his grandchild Tate. Unfortunately, he leaves saddened as he does not get to see Tate, prompting Monica to quickly question Casey about his father's visit. Meanwhile, across town, Rip Wheeler, John's loyal right-hand man, introduces himself to Jimmy. He sternly lectures Jimmy about his actions, showing him the Yellowstone brand, which is part of the initiation into joining the Yellowstone. The sight of the brand leaves Jimmy terrified. Rip explains that Jimmy has two choices, either go to jail or join the ranch. He reveals that he too is branded, which convinces Jimmy to accept his fate. Trying to hide his pain, Jimmy allows Rip to brand him. The following morning, John and his son Lee are seen driving, checking up on their livestock. They engage in a heated argument about Lee's perceived incompetence. Suddenly, John notices an animal in distress. They both rush to assist a cow that is in pain, and through their combined efforts, they manage to get the animal back on its feet, watching it quickly run off. Taking a moment to rest, the father and son then have a seat and continuing their earlier discussion. Lee is told he is to become John's prodigy. Back on the ranch, Jamie is greeted by Beth in the early morning. John simultaneously notices a man playing golf in the distance and he quickly confronts him. Discovering it to be Dan Jenkins, John tells him he doesn't appreciate his plans of building things on his ranch. Telling John to accept his fate, Dan is instead threatened and told he will be stopped. Upon his arrival home, meanwhile, Rip is greeted by Beth while Casey and his son Tate eat ice cream and talk with each other when Dan shows up. Casey immediately takes off driving with his son, bringing him to the Yellowstone ranch to finally meet his grandfather for good. John is taken by surprise at their presence but is overjoyed, picking up Tate in his arms as Casey is warmly greeted by his siblings. Casey and Beth share a laugh together, and he is invited to join the cowboys for a ride. As they all work together, they enjoy their time, reinforcing their bond. Later, the brothers go fishing, an activity that allows them to reconnect and bond as a family, something they haven't done in a long time. They sit around eating the fish they caught, reminiscing and asking Casey why it has taken him so long to come back. Casey playfully teases his older brother Lee, and when he throws something at him, Tate retaliates for his dad, causing the brothers to erupt in laughter. Meanwhile, John and Rip talk with a man who informs them that new buildings are planned which will impact John's land and the river. Back at the house, Casey has a tense conversation with his brother-in-law, Robert, warning him not to mess with the cattle anymore. Their conversation is interrupted when Thomas arrives to speak with Casey. He warns him not to provoke his father as it will only make him angrier, advising him to go through his dad before making any decisions about building. The next morning, John and Thomas are seen discussing the future of the ranch. They don't see eye to eye on the new project, leaving Thomas frustrated and angry with John's response. Back at Casey's house, Monica's grandfather tells Casey about how the meeting went, warning him that a conflict is imminent due to John's decision to protest the project. He advises Casey to go home. Arriving at the Yellowstone Ranch, Jimmy is instructed by Rip on what his job entails. Rip tells him to get on a horse as the cowboys prepare themselves for the impending conflict. Jamie disagrees with his father's tactics, but we see all the cowboys rallying behind John, who goes in his helicopter. Meanwhile, Casey is left to contemplate his next move, noticing cars driving past and realizing the gravity of the situation. He is stuck with the difficult choices he has to make. We see the army that John has gathered, and they begin to get to work under Rip's instructions, preparing for what lies ahead. That night, a large crowd gathers at the bar, which is showcasing the Paradise Valley project. Dan is seen warmly greeting the visitors, ensuring everyone feels welcome. He then steps outside to speak with one of his investors. Using his cunning and persuasive words, Dan assures the investor that everything is proceeding smoothly. Suddenly, their conversation is interrupted by a massive explosion, which leaves them in shock. Simultaneously, we see all the cowboys heading toward the destination, with John hovering above in a helicopter ready to lead the attack. Robert Long and his men, who are also prepared for battle, hear the chopper approaching. John shines the helicopter's lights upon them, causing them to scatter. Casey is spotted by his father, but before they can communicate, Robert and the native Indians open fire, forcing them to retreat under heavy gunfire. The police are also on the scene, trying to control the chaos. Despite the constant gunfire aimed at him, John bravely continues his mission, even managing to make the police duck for cover. Lee and the cowboys push through with the cattle but face fierce resistance. In a dramatic turn, Lee is shot and trampled by Robert, but Casey arrives just in time to save him. He quickly tries to aid his injured brother, but Robert, seizing the opportunity, attempts to kill them both. Casey is left with no choice but to shoot Robert first, standing over him to finish the job. With the immediate threat neutralized, Casey rushes back to his brother Lee, only to find him succumbing to his injuries. Overwhelmed with grief, Casey mourns the loss of his brother. The next morning, Jamie is on the phone trying to find his brother, only for John to see Casey riding his horse. He rushes over quickly, only to see Casey all bloodied up and his other son dead. He walks with the horse Lee is on whilst Case rides to the house. John carries his son in his arms, resting on the floor, having one last conversation with his fallen son. He sits there peacefully with his heart broken over his son as Monica comes outside, seeing the helicopter with Casey in it. She runs towards her husband, hugging him. Meanwhile, still persistent, Dan rushes across to the river, noticing it has been blown up and that John Dutton stuck to his word. Back at home, John and Jamie watch the news before John starts questioning Jamie. Also watching the events, the senator and Thomas discuss John as she gives her full support to Thomas. At the Yellowstone Ranch, a funeral takes place for Lee as everyone mourns him. John stares into the sky, seeing the tombstones of his family, knowing he also has lost another. The family walk back without saying a word before John approaches Casey, who is broken, trying to console him. John invites him as Casey hands him a horse, letting his father walk with his dead son's horse away to the barn whilst crying profusely. Monica tries to question Casey about her brother but only receives silence, as we see his chest showing Casey is also branded with the Yellowstone. John approaches Beth and Jamie, holding them, telling them to stay by his side. The next morning, John Dutton is seen attempting to tame a wild horse, determined to bring the beast under control. Rip stands nearby, observing the scene with a critical eye as the horse goes wild, eventually throwing John off its back with a violent buck. As John recovers from the fall, Rip turns his attention to Jimmy, taping him to the unruly horse. Jimmy panics as the horse begins to thrash about, causing chaos in the corral. The other cowboys stand around laughing and cheering, entertained by the spectacle. They watch in amazement as Jimmy clings to the horse for dear life, astonished that he manages to stay on as the horse bucks furiously. Meanwhile, Casey is hard at work on another part of the ranch. Despite taking a hard fall, he quickly gets back up, visibly angry but determined to continue working. His son Tate watches him from a distance, curious and concerned. Casey, noticing his son's attention, tells Tate to cover his ears as he prepares to set off an explosion. The blast is powerful, sending debris flying and revealing a hidden skeleton buried beneath the earth. Back at the office, Jamie is summoned by the governor, who confronts him with disturbing photos of his deceased brother and Robert Long. The governor informs Jamie that there was a third shooter involved in the incident and pressures him to come up with a solution quickly. If he fails, they threaten to bring down everyone associated with the Yellowstone Ranch. Jamie, feeling the weight of the situation, seeks advice from Beth, but their conversation quickly escalates into a heated sibling argument. Meanwhile, Jimmy is still desperately riding the wild horse, his endurance astonishing the onlookers. The spectacle is only interrupted when Jamie arrives to inform the group about the latest developments concerning Casey. He reveals the details of the medical report, which enrages John, who immediately grabs Jamie and demands that he find a solution to the problem. John then heads over to Casey's place, where he shares a moment of bonding with his grandson Tate. However, the peaceful family time is cut short when Casey arrives. John wastes no time in questioning his son about the incident, but Casey denies any involvement. John continues to press him, but Casey remains resolute, refusing to reveal what happened. Back on the ranch, John and Jamie are running out of options. They struggle to devise a plan to strong-arm the doctors and control the situation. Simultaneously, Thomas and his men review the reports and come to the conclusion that Casey might have been the third shooter involved in the deadly encounter. Finally, Jimmy is allowed to rest, collapsing off the horse in exhaustion. Rip, satisfied with Jimmy's performance, jumps on the horse himself to test it out, pleased with the results. After leaving the barn, Beth confronts Rip and asks him to take her out for the evening, to which Rip agrees without hesitation. Later that same night, John attends the Derby with Carl, enjoying the excitement of watching the bulls in action. As they watch the bulls, John takes the opportunity to ask Carl for a favor, instructing him not to mention anything about Casey. Carl agrees, and they continue to enjoy the spectacle of the bulls, though the weight of the favor hangs in the air. On their night out, Rip and Beth watch the animals sitting in the car talking about death. Being the crazy Beth, she exits chasing the animals, and Rip follows in horror, telling her she's crazy. Meanwhile, in the bunkhouse, the cowboys tell Jimmy to take a shower, grabbing him, only to see he is branded. Lloyd reveals his brand, telling Jimmy he can have his shower in the morning, leaving the cowboys no choice but to leave him alone. Beth arrives back at home, talking to her dad as he informs her of the decision he must make regarding Lee. He attends the church whilst the pastor talks to him, reassuring him in his faith, but John has other things on his mind. He tells the pastor his plan, saying he owes him. The father is seen giving a speech to the many people in attendance, asking them to help their suffering neighbor John, and not to judge him on what he must do, justifying his actions. Still at home, Casey is seen on the phone talking to his sergeant, asking to be placed back in action, only to be overheard by Monica. They go out together on a drive, arguing about his choice to go back to war, and asks what the real reason is. Suddenly, they are met with a shock explosion, almost causing them to have an accident. Casey quickly rushes to the scene to help, only to see a dying man asking to be killed peacefully. He rushes to the truck to put the man out of his misery, as his wife follows, asking her about the ambulance's whereabouts. Left with no choice, Casey shoots the man, putting him out of his misery. The sheriff and Thomas arrive on scene whilst they decide what to do. The officer asks for Casey's gun, telling him he's going to make this go away, before Thomas asks Case to tag along with him. They sit around discussing family, trying to see if Casey was the third shooter. He tries telling him they're all evil, as Casey listens careful with his words. On that somber night, the cowboys gather together, their faces etched with the weight of the task ahead. They carefully carry a coffin, each step deliberate as they execute a grim plan designed to protect one life by sacrificing another. In a secluded spot, they throw a body bag into a roaring oven, the flames consuming the remains of a son, all in a desperate attempt to save another. John and Jamie exchange a sorrowful glance, their eyes reflecting the deep sadness of their decision. They both know that despite the heartbreak, this is their only option. As they drive back home, the night air heavy with the consequences of their actions, Casey's attention is drawn to a wolf standing silently on the street. The sight momentarily distracts him, leading to a fatal accident. Meanwhile, at the examiner's office, a tense scene unfolds. A man is startled when Rip suddenly appears, his presence an ominous sign of what's about to occur. The man, aware of the danger, tries to put up a fight, but Rip is too strong, easily overpowering him and knocking him out. When the man regains consciousness, Rip coldly questions his work ethics, forcing him to comply with the orders given. With an air of finality, Rip takes the man's laptop before ending his life. Back at home, Casey miraculously returns, though his spirit is heavy with the knowledge of what he must do. He sits down with Monica, his voice tinged with sorrow as he tells her that although he doesn't want to leave, it is necessary for the greater good. The words hang in the air, their meaning clear but painful. Casey then enters his son's room, seeking a moment of normalcy in the midst of chaos. Monica stands outside the door, silently weeping as she listens, her heart breaking at the thought of Casey's departure. After their grim plan comes to fruition, John visits the graveyard carrying a small urn containing Lee's ashes. With a solemn expression, he pours the ashes over his wife's grave, mixing them with the earth where she rests. The act is a final farewell. On March 30, 1997, the sun casts a warm glow over the open fields as a younger Casey and Beth ride their horses alongside their mother, enjoying a rare, serene moment together. Their mother, full of life and affection, waits patiently for Beth as she adores Casey. Suddenly, her horse becomes wild without warning, and throws her to the ground with a brutal force that leaves her injured and breathless. In her pain and confusion, she directs her blame at Beth, accusing her of causing the incident, and orders her to ride back. Meanwhile, back at the Yellowstone Ranch, the day unfolds with the familiar sounds of cattle being branded. John, ever the stern and practical rancher, is teaching Jamie the ropes of ranch work, overseeing the branding process as his cowboys labor diligently. As he surveys the scene, he suddenly notices two horses returning without their riders as they ride hard across the terrain. John's heart skips a beat when he spots Beth's horse in the distance. Spurring his horse forward, he soon finds her far behind, distraught and alone. He pulls her into his arms as she sobs, unable to tell him where their mother and Casey are. The night descends, and with it comes the harrowing discovery of their mother's lifeless body, with Casey still by her side, frozen in shock and fear. A light suddenly shines on him. John arrives just in time, his presence a beacon of safety. In the present day, Casey and his son Tate spend a quiet afternoon practicing shooting at targets. Casey's skill with a gun is apparent as he effortlessly hits each target, impressing his son. Afterward, they drive back together, sharing a lighthearted moment as they snack on gummy bears. The mood shifts, however, when Tate, in a moment of vulnerability, asks his father about his time in the army. The question brings tears to Tate's eyes as he pleads with his father not to leave again. Elsewhere, Jamie receives an unexpected call from Mike, who nervously inquires about the situation with the medical examiner. Jamie, always quick on his feet, immediately turns the tables, threatening Mike with blackmail to ensure his silence. Later, while still on the road, Casey's sharp instincts kick in when he notices a van suspiciously parked on the reservation. Sensing trouble, he pulls out his pistol and exits the vehicle to investigate. Approaching cautiously, he soon discovers a young girl tied up inside the van. Before he can act, he is confronted by a man, but Casey's reflexes are swift and he guns the man down without hesitation, allowing the van to speed off. After quickly hiding Tate, he sets off in pursuit of the fleeing vehicle. The situation escalates as Tate, left behind, suddenly notices a snake slithering toward him. Simultaneously, the van crashes, forcing Casey to continue the chase on foot. With the agility and precision of a seasoned cowboy, Casey expertly ropes the fleeing man, pulling him down and killing him instantly. He then returns to the crashed van where the terrified girl awaits rescue. Casey gently reassures her, carefully cutting away the tape that binds her as she shakily asks if he killed the man who hurt her. With a nod, he confirms it before turning back to his son, who proudly shows him the dead snake he managed to kill on his own. Meanwhile, the girl, emboldened by her newfound freedom, delivers a final kick to the lifeless body of her captor, refusing Casey's offer to go to the police. With no other choice, Casey is left to bury the bodies, the weight of the day's events heavy on his conscience as he protects the girl and his son from further harm. While John and Jamie are being questioned about the explosion that occurred the previous night, tension hangs heavy in the air. The authorities press them for details, but John remains stoic, his years of experience in navigating such situations evident in his calm demeanor. The scene shifts to a quiet neighborhood where Casey pulls up to the house of the girl he recently rescued. Her father, already informed of the harrowing events, meets Casey outside. With a firm handshake, the father invites Casey inside where the two men exchange solemn words. They sit together, the gravity of their actions weighing heavily on them as they discuss the next steps. The most pressing concern is how to dispose of the bodies without leaving a trace. Meanwhile, Thomas, dressed sharply in a suit, is seen driving towards the Indian reservation, his mind focused on the task ahead. However, his journey is abruptly interrupted when he is ambushed by state troopers who have set up a spike strip across the road. His car screeches to a halt, and before he can react, the officers have their weapons drawn, ordering him out of the vehicle. Understanding the severity of the situation, Thomas complies, dropping to his knees as they arrest him. Back to Casey, the bodies need to be dealt with. Casey realizes he needs to drop Tate off first. He rushes home where Monica meets him at the door, her eyes filled with concern as she asks what happened. Casey, knowing he must protect her from the grim reality, quickly dismisses her worries as a task is at hand. In custody, Thomas is marched into the local jail, with reality setting in. A few moments later, he is informed that he has a visitor. To his surprise, it's John who steps into the room. The two men exchange icy glares as John reminds Thomas of the warnings he chose to ignore. John's words are laced with menace, his calm tone only heightening the tension. Thomas, despite his predicament, attempts to assert his dominance, but John remains unfazed, walking away as he makes a phone call warning the cowboys. In the meantime, on the ranch, Rip and the cowboys seem to be enjoying riding their horses while Beth watches and is cut short when John asks her to come talk to him. When they talk, she reminds him of her mother's death, but chooses not to remember that day as company arrives. Casey and the girl's father wait till nightfall and begin digging, ready to hide the crime scene. They proceed to put the men in the holes they buried and begin pouring gasoline, lighting the men on fire. Jamie sits outside saddened and begins conversing with Beth, talking a lot of gibberish, causing Beth to rile him up with her responses as he tells her to follow him. Entering the barn, Jamie is angry that John put Beth ahead of him in the running. Stupidly enough, he mentions their mother and how it was her fault. She reacts by punching and slapping her brother whilst he defends himself, punching her to the ground. She scuffles, saying he's just a boy, walking away embarrassed by her brother's hit. Arriving back at the house, John confronts Jamie, who tells him he is going to join in the running against Beth, but is threatened about B laying a hand on Beth, warning him not to hit her again. Looking for revenge, Dan sits down with a man trying to get him to convict John for blowing up the river. He notices Beth and approaches her, sitting down next to her, and is immediately shut down by her words, vowing to break him and his generation continuing to drink. After the cowboys finish, Jimmy is seen closing the barn, only to see John sitting in the barn striking up a conversation with him. He asks him about his family, responding his grandfather is the only one left, leaving John sad remembering his wife. Morning comes and John is woken up still in the barn as he gets up seeing the trucks with all the cattle instructing them what to do. An enraged Thomas is seen out on bail while Casey is seen riding his horse only to hear gunshots. They rush into the house only to see the girl dead. Elsewhere, a crew of men is seen driving and doing some surveying coincidentally right next to the bodies of the men Casey just buried. Early in the morning, the cowboys get back to work while John and Rip observe and drink coffee together. Thomas Drinkwater finds a piece of evidence from the hole Casey had made and one of the workers get rowdy before getting shut down by him. A massive pile of cattle is led by Rip whilst John flies above keeping an eye on his stock. Jimmy takes a fall trying to ride but is quick to get back up and Lloyd controls his horse for him, reassuring him he is a cowboy and never to quit as he gets back on his horse. Meanwhile, back at Casey's place, Monica tries cleaning up the blood left by the young girl but is unable to, almost puking. Casey tries to tell her he will do the rest and talks with Monica, who cries hugging her husband, unable to comprehend how the girl died. Spending time with his horse, Jimmy hears a noise, noticing one of the animals has split up from the cattle. The husband and wife sit on the steps talking to each other, discussing Tate's future, telling him she wants him to take him far away. Loading up the cattle, Rip instructs the men on what to do as two men sit and watch talking about John. Back at the bar, Beth comes to Dan's place threatening his men and making a massive scene. Listening to the mother of the deceased girl talk, Monica packs up the car with her as she leaves the place behind for good. The man who was watching John comes to check up on him but is quickly pulled to the side and the man tells him about the cancer John had. John informs him to keep it a secret and is interrupted by Casey, who comes also to visit his father, allowing Tate to also spend time with them. Meanwhile, Thomas arrives at Monica's house telling her about the violence that has been taking place and begins asking about Casey. Bonding at the river, John teaches Tate how to make a fire, asking him to collect sticks and branches to make this fire. John hears a sound, noticing Tate has disappeared, and quickly runs to check up on his grandson. He panics immediately, jumping into the river, rescuing Tate from the water as he carries him. John starts the fire, trying to warm Tate up, keeping him warm, worried about his safety. Handling business, Jimmy arrives while holding the missing cattle, showing Rip is capable of handling his own. As they make their way back to the house, Fred trips Jimmy over, causing a fight to break out between the two. Getting beat up by Fred, the cowboys try to hold Jimmy as he keeps getting back up. Noticing this, Rip slams Fred, smashing him, threatening the cowboys about laying their hands on a branded man. Fred is whipped by Rip, who doesn't appreciate his bullying tactics, showing him how it feels, before telling Jimmy he is a cowboy and to keep fighting, demanding him to show the cowboys who he is. Sitting by the fire, we see the cancer that was cut out. Lying to Tate, telling him he got into a sword fight, making him laugh. Arriving in the presence of Beth, Dan questions her motives and invites her with him. Worried about Casey's reaction, John tells Tate not to say anything as Casey comes telling his dad what happened to his son before riding off. Rip also informs the boss about the situation with Fred, saying he's got to go, indicating to take him to the train station, which is where they kill and dump the bodies. Beth and Dan rock up to a bar together, proceeding to drink and talk together before she is approached by a cowboy. Dan tries to stand up for her and is hit while Beth enjoys every bit of it, and causes a fight between a cowboy and Dan. She stays at the bar herself, enjoying the show and music performed by the cowboys. In the meantime, Monica comes to the hospital checking up on Tate, as Casey knows his wife is upset by this. At the Yellowstone Ranch, John is also seen talking to himself about how he almost lost his grandson. Listening to Rip, Lloyd drives Fred to the station and pulls over to the side of the street. Fred is then quickly shot and disposed of down a cliff before Lloyd takes off. The family also drive back from the hospital and are being pulled over before Casey tries to react. Monica tells him to give up, allowing him to step out of the car, following the instructions of the officers. Walking backwards, he drops to the floor whilst his wife watches him being cuffed. Still at the bar alone, Rip surprisingly shows up to keep Beth company. The next day begins with John and Rip observing a professional horse rider performing an array of impressive tricks. The rider's control over the horse catches their attention, and both men are visibly impressed by his skill. As the rider approaches them, he starts negotiating the price for the horse, despite its steep cost. The conversation is interrupted when Monica and Tate arrive, drawing John's attention away from the deal. Sensing the urgency of Casey's situation, John immediately makes a phone call while Jamie springs into action, preparing the helicopter for a swift departure. John reassures Monica and Tate, promising them that he is doing everything in his power to bring Casey home safely. As the helicopter lifts off, Monica watches it disappear into the sky, silently wishing her husband the best of luck. Meanwhile, in Thomas's office, Casey is under intense scrutiny as he is questioned about the two men whose bodies were recently discovered. Casey recounts how the men were predators who had harmed a young girl, shifting Thomas's perspective on the case. Just as the tension in the room peaks, Jamie arrives, perfectly timed to represent his brother. The conversation takes a turn when the ballistics report is brought up, showing that the bullets match Casey's gun. However, Jamie, ever the sharp legal mind, cleverly reminds the officer that Casey and the officer had exchanged weapons during a previous cover-up. This leaves Thomas with little choice but to agree to return the pistols to their rightful owners. With this resolution, Casey is released, and as they leave the office, Thomas begins plotting his next move against the Dutton family. The brothers board the helicopter, eager to return to the ranch and be there for Monica during this trying time. Later, after Fred's mysterious disappearance, a man named Walker is released from prison, only to find Rip waiting for him outside. Rip calls Walker over, seeking to learn more about him and assess whether he is tough enough to work at the ranch. Walker's gritty demeanor impresses Rip, who offers him a position at the ranch. Walker agrees, understanding that there will be a price to pay for the opportunity. Rip lays out the terms, and Walker, determined to prove himself, accepts the challenge. In the meantime, Beth is in a meeting with Bob, strategizing to improve her standing in the business world. Their discussion is interrupted when Dan arrives, his presence immediately catching Beth's attention. Sensing an opportunity, she declares that her first target is Mr. Jenkins, making it clear she is ready to take on the competition. True to her fearless nature, Beth boldly sits down with Dan and his wife, initiating a conversation that quickly turns tense. Dan, clearly unnerved by Beth's audacity, warns her to stay away from his family. After their confrontation, Beth returns to Bob, who ominously informs her that Dan is a devil in disguise, leaving Beth more determined than ever to outmaneuver her rivals. While Tate spends time at the ranch with John, the two bond as they skip rocks across the water, with John using the opportunity to teach his grandson some basic principles of physics. The simple activity brings them closer, the connection between grandfather and grandson growing stronger with each shared moment. Nearby, Monica and John finally sit down for a conversation, breaking the ice between them. Their discussion is cut short when they hear the helicopter approaching. As it lands, both Jamie and Casey step out, and John's face lights up with relief and happiness to have his son back. He immediately joins Casey, eager to spend some much-needed time with his reunited family. Meanwhile, the cowboys continue their relentless work, their day stretching on under the hot sun. Jimmy, struggling with exhaustion, is unable to keep up and eventually breaks down, his frustration spilling over. Lloyd, ever the mentor, rushes to his side, offering words of comfort and encouragement. He reminds Jimmy that this tough work is all part of becoming a man, urging him to push through the pain and get back in the saddle. Later, as the Dutton family enjoys a moment of peace, John takes Casey aside for a heart-to-heart conversation. He expresses his desire for Casey to take over, his refusal sparking anger in John, who leaves. Seeking to prove his worth, Jamie meets with Mel Thompson, the president of Montana State University. During their meeting, Jamie introduces Monica to Mel, who is immediately impressed by her. Mel mentions the university and expresses his wish for Monica to join the faculty as a professor, even discussing the attractive salary that comes with the position. The offer intrigues Monica as it could significantly help her support her family. John, overhearing the conversation, pulls Monica aside to give his blessing, urging her to take the job offer, recognizing how it could benefit her and the family. Back at the ranch, Casey returns to riding his horse, only to be taken aback when Tate expresses his desire to stay with his grandfather. The unexpected request triggers an outburst from Casey, who, unable to contain his emotions, yells at Tate, causing the young boy to run off in tears. Elsewhere, Beth prepares to leave and heads towards her car when a man offers to drive her. True to her fiery nature, she sharply declines his offer. Frustrated and impaired, she attempts to call Jamie, but he lets the phone ring, not wanting to deal with her. Beth, persistent and stubborn, calls again, forcing Jamie to pick up. She demands that he send Rip to drive her home, leaving Jamie with no choice but to come to her aid. After spending time with his horse, John invites Casey and the rest of the family to stay the night at the ranch, an offer they gratefully accept. However, the peace is short-lived, as Beth and Jamie, as usual, can't seem to be in the same room without clashing. Their argument escalates, with both hurling insults and even physical blows at each other. In a dramatic turn, Beth pulls out a revolver and presses it to her own face, daring Jamie to push her over the edge. Jamie, unfazed, coldly encourages her to pull the trigger. The tension is palpable, the room thick with unresolved anger and pain. Suddenly, a gunshot rings out and the car they're in swerves violently. Beth, her hand shaking, aims the gun at Jamie and expresses her resentment over how their mother never loved her. Back at the Jenkins residence, his wife laughs uncontrollably at the fun time she had with Beth, only to leave Dan with second thoughts on how to beat the Duttons. Reaching the bunkhouse, Walker makes himself comfortable around his new cowboys, playing the guitar for them, showing off his skills as a musician. While singing, they are all mesmerized by his voice, cause every word he says has meaning to which they can relate to. Rip enters, asking Walker and Jimmy to come with him. Drunk Beth comes home, only to see her dad reading a book with Tate, making her scream in anger whilst John listens. With the pressure getting to Jamie, he pours a drink and sits down with his dad, asking him to send Beth away because she is out of control. He asks him to take her spot but doesn't believe he is evil enough to handle the job. In the middle of the night, Monica takes a stroll spying on the cowboys, noticing that Walker is about to be branded. He doesn't agree with the conditions, trying to find another way out, but Rip convinces him otherwise. Being a hardened criminal, he gets on his knees, revealing his chest, taking the brand like a man without screaming, as Rip helps him out, hugging him on becoming a part of them. They share a moment together, bonding over the fire, leading Monica to walk away. On the next day at Yellowstone, we see the ranch in full view and Casey Dutton up early for work, entering the barn, saddling up his horse. He pats the horse, treating it nicely before jumping on to ride him away from the ranch into free territory. Casey rides till the sun rises, coming to a halt, but the wild horse takes off on him, only to see a bear directly in front of him. He moves back slowly, whilst the bear closes in, roaring at him. Luckily enough, Rip fires a shot, scaring the bear away before Casey insults him. Rip, being the stronger man, shapes up with Casey and goes blow for blow until Rip wins and rides off as if nothing happened. Meanwhile, John talks with Monica, who curiously asks him about the brand the cowboys get. She wants to know why he branded Casey, and she is told that Casey got Monica pregnant and disobeyed his order not to marry her. Monica now understands that Casey chose her over his family, and she thanks John for his honesty. Sitting at the dinner table, Tate decides which donut he wants to eat, and is spoiled by his grandfather, allowing him to do whatever he pleases. At the river, Sarah Nguyen and her friend Fish, reading the paper, seeing John's face, getting her excited. Meanwhile, Thomas sits down with a businesswoman, trying to buy land, especially the ones connected to the Yellowstone Ranch. She also informs him about what happened to the river due to Dan trying to build, to which he seems unfazed. The siblings drive to a meeting and are late due to Beth wasting time. Finally arriving at the governor's office, they are shocked at Beth's presence. Jamie is introduced to a manager who is a great asset to help them in the running. The governor and Mike come up with a plan on how to accomplish all the votes and are interrupted by Beth's rude comments, excusing them out of the room to have a word with Beth. She talks about the tragedy Beth has suffered, telling her she is not easily bullied, making Beth angry. She reveals her real plan, which is to ruin careers for a living, threatening the governor to stay away from her father. Jamie is summoned by the governor regarding the information she received, saying that John had cancer, making Jamie leave in a hurry. After the altercation, Casey and Rip give each other the harsh truth as he picks up a folder containing the picture of his dead brother-in-law. Back in the office, the governor is worried about John's decisions in placing his daughter in a public office, discrediting her skills and ability. After spending time on the ranch, Monica and Tate drive back to his school, dropping him off, only to notice a group of students punching on. She rushes to stop it and is punched unconscious as Tate screams in shock, seeing the blood coming from her head. Casey receives a call informing him about his wife, and he as well as John quickly drive towards the hospital. He gets out, running to his wife's side, seeing her being bandaged up. John finally gets home after a rough day, only to see Beth and Jamie waiting for him to discuss family matters. Jamie and Beth drill their dad for hiding his cancer from them and invites Beth in to talk. He goes off at his daughter for disrespecting the governor, making him angry, and tells her to leave if she can't follow his rules. In the meantime, Dan and Melody talk about their future projects and John Dutton. They try and figure out a way to beat John, and Dan is impressed by her ideas. Melody tells him he needs a face for his company, to which Thomas Rainwater stands up and volunteers, asking to be a part of this project. He tells them about his plan to build a casino, guaranteeing Dan he can 15% of revenue if he agrees. Melody pulls Dan to the side, unsure if they should trust Thomas, but is ignored and shakes his hand, coming to an agreement. After bringing his wife home, Monica's grandfather takes Tate outside for a heart-to-heart conversation. Tate listens intently, understanding the gravity of the situation even at his young age. Inside the house, Casey is doing his best to care for Monica, who is clearly unwell. As he tends to her, his attention is suddenly drawn to the sound of a wild horse outside. He's startled to see a drone hovering near their house, its presence suspicious. Casey's instincts kick in and tries to take it down. His suspicions deepen when he spots a car parked nearby, seemingly observing their every move. Without hesitation, Casey rushes outside, determined to confront the person in the car. He manages to block the car's path, but before he can get any answers, the driver speeds away. Meanwhile, John and Carl are enjoying a peaceful day of fishing in the river, their lines cast into the water as they relax in the natural beauty around them. Their tranquility is briefly interrupted by the sound of an approaching boat, so they move aside to make way. John recognizes the two women aboard who had seen his face in the newspaper earlier. Back at home, Casey returns to find Monica struggling, her condition worsening. He rushes to her side, but before he can do anything, she collapses to the ground. Panic sets in as Casey frantically begins performing CPR with fear and desperation. Monica's grandfather watches in horror, unable to do anything but hope that Casey can save her. In the next episode, John is seen driving and notices many people standing close to a bear. He approaches them armed with a rifle, warning them to get back, and tells them he owns the land. They argue with John, causing him to fire his rifle as they all run away before John gets his final say. At the hospital, the doctors work on Monica performing surgery on her. Whilst Casey sits outside, the doctor informs him about his wife's condition, allowing Casey to visit his wife. He touches her hand, leaving, unable to handle it. Meanwhile, Tate starts screaming at the nurses, making the security grab a hold of him, giving Casey the chance to punch them before being apprehended. The doctor argues with him about Tate, telling him to find someone to watch his son, irritated that an altercation happened. In the meantime, at a dinner, John gives a speech to all the people in attendance, mentioning his loved ones who he has lost. He gives an inspiring speech, receiving a standing ovation. Having a seat, John sits alone while everyone around him has a good time. Trying to win the race, Jamie is with his assistant, having a good time with her, preparing to become Attorney General. Jamie is upfront with his motives towards running for Attorney General, saying he wants to become one of the most powerful men, changing his family's life for the better, leaving his assistant stunned. Back at Casey's house, Tate struggles to sleep, calling for his dad, who cries heartbroken over his wife. Making his way back home, John tells Jamie about how he looked foolish at the dinner, as none of his kids were by his side. He tries contacting Beth, who sits in bed reminiscing back to December 25, 1996, where the whole family is together as one celebrating Christmas. Noticing Beth isn't there, her mum checks up on her, only to see her on the floor crying, comforting her, while John also tries to help. But his wife tells him she's handling Beth. The mother sits with Beth, telling her she's the strongest one out of the siblings, which is why she's so hard on her, informing her daughter about her upbringing. Snapping out of it, she goes to the barn, attempting to ride a horse for the first time in a long time, causing her to fall off. Watching her, Walker makes fun of her, while she jumps back on, giving it another go only to fail once more. He rides the horse himself, being very gentle with it. Asking for advice on how to ride, Walker demonstrates on her what the horse feels, giving her motivation to get back on and give it another shot. Climbing on gently, he instructs her on what to do, while her dad and Rip watch her ride for the first time. Meanwhile, at the hospital, Monica's grandfather brings her sage, causing the fire alarm to go off, but are stunned when she regains consciousness. Back at the office, Thomas and Dan discuss their next step for the buildings. He tells Dan he plans to take everything off John Dutton, and to come up with an answer quickly on whether he wants to be his partner, dismissing himself. Dan sticks around with his team, deciding on accepting Thomas's proposal, also coming up with a way to get a better percentage from the hotel and the casino they plan on building. Doing checkups, John is seen doing scans whilst his doctor relays him the results, rescheduling him to come back in. On his way out, he sees Tate, asking what he's doing at the hospital. At the Yellowstone Ranch, Jamie is seen working before he is interrupted by a strange man, opening the door armed with a rifle. He aims at the man, making him drop to the floor out of fear, expressing he means no harm, serving him with a subpoena. The next morning, the cowboys ride through the forest, attempting to find the bear John seen. Once they do, they prepare to shoot, realizing they forgot their weapons, leaving them with no choice but to confront the bear head-on. Hazing the bear, Jimmy falls off his horse as the bear closes in, allowing him to climb the tree, screaming for help from the cowboys. They come to his rescue, roping in the bear while Jimmy watches in horror. He finally comes down but notices his horse has ridden off and begins walking back to the ranch. Conscious again, Monica attempts to wiggle her toes while the doctors do tests on her. A worried John asks the doctor on how serious her condition is, telling them to keep an eye on her in case of any internal bleeding. John offers to take Tate back to the ranch. Reluctant, he goes, leaving his mum behind. Riding alone, Rip is seen getting off his horse, armed with a rifle, looking to shoot the bear. He chases after it and sees two people hanging off the side of the cliff. He attempts to rescue them, throwing them a rope, instructing them to go one at a time. Panicking, they don't listen to Rip, causing one of them to fall off the cliff. Suddenly, a bear shows up and, making Rip react to kill the bear, causes the second person to fall off the cliff. Meanwhile, at the sheriff's office, Thomas is informed about Monica's situation and says the kid could be charged with manslaughter if she dies. He enters the office, talking to the young man, who asks about Monica's well-being. Thomas gives him the two options he has, leaving the kid to think to himself. Driving back to his house, Thomas talks with his driver about trying to make a change for the better for the good of his people, giving them a second chance in life. Arriving back at the Yellowstone Ranch, John and Tate enter the house looking for food, which leaves John in excruciating pain. Also at home, Beth is on the phone asking for information about the Paradise Valley as her dad comes in, telling her to take care of Tate before leaving. Beth introduces herself to Tate, babysitting him, asking him what he would like to eat. In the meantime, upstairs, John pukes his guts out, wiping the blood off his face. Looking after his wife, Casey attempts to feed his wife, worried about her. She repeats the same question she got the answer to, leaving her grandfather worried about her. At the office, Jamie gives a speech for his campaign, getting a round of applause from the people. Rip tries to contact Jamie and John but doesn't get into touch with them, as we see John talking to himself, asking to feel better, struggling. Holding his wife's hand, Monica lets go, realizing something, which makes Casey sad. In the bunkhouse, the cowboys seem to be having a good time, and Rip walks in on Beth enjoying herself before leaving with his rifle in hand. July 4, 1997, a young man sees a deceased kid, making him pick up a pan, also seeing his mum being abused. Enraged, he smashes his dad's head in with the pan. The cowboys inform John about the young kid who got caught trespassing. They enter the place looking for the kid and find him covered in blood. He shows no fear though, and John informs him about the trouble he's in, putting his hands up, whilst John asks him questions about the abuse that took place, and we find out this young man is Rip. He feeds him, offering a job to Rip, telling him if he accepts he will have to pay with a bit of pain. Back to the present moment, the sheriffs and John are seen at the cliff. As he is told, shooting the bear is a federal defense. John defends Rip, arguing with the sheriff, who tells him to call Jamie. He tells Rip not to worry, whilst Donnie keeps insinuating the story is a lie, making Rip and John angry. Meanwhile, a nurse does physiotherapy with Monica, getting her to walk around in the hospital. She talks with her grandfather, pleading to let her stay with him as she doesn't remember who Casey is. Jimmy's assistant talks with a woman about the shooting that took place, which angers his assistant, who comes to his defense. In the meantime, Casey gets home and notices a big mess has been made inside his house, confusing him as he rushes back outside. He runs towards the skeleton he found, which has disappeared. Arriving at the ranch, Rip is confronted by an officer who takes his rifle off him, investigating his shooting. Conversing with him, she argues with Rip, who tells her about the horsefly, causing a wild reaction from her horse. He chases her down and sees a metal pole stuck inside of her stomach. Rip cuts the horse loose so he doesn't drag the officer, who doesn't trust him to rescue her, making her horrified to die. He lifts her up and begins distracting her while the chopper arrives ready to take her to the hospital. Cleaning his house, Casey is sad as he is all alone packing up his things, entering his car, leaving the property. On the golf course, Dan and Thomas continue discussing their hotel and casino, trying to reassure each other that the build is worth it. Thomas tells him John will have to pay double the tax, and that when he gives up Yellowstone, Dan can have the whole ranch, which makes him excited to do business with Thomas. In the meantime, Beth and her assistant investigate Paradise Valley, looking at all the paperwork, figuring out how he is leveraging his property. Picking up his son from school, Tate is sad when he hears his bones have been stolen. They arrive at the hospital, to which Casey sits down with Monica, asking her if she remembers him. She tells him she knows who he is but refuses to beg him to stay any longer and asks him to tell the truth about her brother. Casey tells Monica he killed Lee, which makes them both sad as Monica doesn't want Tate to be around his dad or himself. He stays outside staring at the ground till nightfall before leaving. Meanwhile, at Dan's house, he sees Beth outside and worries about his wife going inside to look for her. He sees her dancing with Beth's assistant, angering him as he goes to leave his house. Dan threatens Beth, while she threatens him back, saying she's going to buy his shares in the stock, making him rethink his options before leaving in his car. At the gas station, Casey is approached by a man asking for help, to which he agrees, telling him he will fill up his gas. The guy gets angry when he doesn't get the cash, getting a reaction out of Casey, who punches the man multiple times, almost killing him. Jamie arrives at home and is screamed at by John, informing him he must withdraw from the race. His son is persistent about becoming Attorney General, putting up a fight with his father, refusing to give up his position. He grabs his dad but is punched to the ground as he tries to hit his dad again, leaving him to be put down, which makes Rip hold Jamie back, whilst John tells him he's not welcome at the ranch anymore. Rip asks if John is okay, saddened by his son's actions, not sure of what to do with the Yellowstone anymore. Walker tells Rip he would like to have a word with him while they sit down and have a drink together, before Walker tells him he's not going to break the law for the ranch. He is reminded of the brand he has on his body and is told he has no choice but to do what they say, as he is now a part of the Yellowstone Ranch. Meanwhile, Jamie comes to his office telling his assistant about his father's decision, which is to pull out of the race. He tells her how he can run against his own dad and is manipulated by her to go get the power he yearns for. She questions his loyalty towards himself, asking him to put his interest before others. At the bunkhouse, Jimmy finally comes back while they all play poker. Jimmy confronts the cowboys about his missing cowboy hat, finally standing up for himself. He is surprised by them as they throw him a new hat, telling him it's a gift from all of them, and he thanks them. On the cliff, the wolves find the bear and begin eating it for dinner as the whole pack begins digging in. Back at the cliff, the bones of the bear are left with the sheriff and John trying to piece together what happened. John finds Rip's bullets and clears him of any foul play as another officer does the same. They threaten the sheriff, shocked at his betrayal, before leaving. At the ranch, Beth's assistant converses with John before Beth joins them, giving them a chance to discuss Jamie. John comes across the governor eating a meal whilst discussing Jamie, demanding him to be thrown out of the race. Surprisingly, they ask John to drop the livestock position, realizing everyone is turning on him. On his way out, he enters a room only to see Jamie, who is terrified of his father. The cowboys continue their job, walking on the ranch learning how to rope in cattle. Jimmy takes a fall, making everyone rush to check up on his well-being. Rip scolds him before going back to the barn, only to see John inside minding his own business. He tells Rip of the situation, telling him things need to happen differently around here now. Beth and John devise a plan to look after the ranch, asking Beth to promise him to always put the Yellowstone first. She arrives at Jamie's office, arrogantly informing him of what's about to happen, as he is taken off the ranch's will. She laughs in his face, antagonizing him, before exiting, giving him a lot to think about. After the news, Jamie talks with a random man, feeling the loneliness of not having his family support him. The next morning, Sarah approaches Jamie telling him her opinion whilst finding out she's a journalist. She gives him the chance to tell her the truth but are interrupted by his assistant, who talks to him privately, making sure Jamie doesn't make a mistake. They ask Sarah how they can help them, devising a plan to make sure he wins the election. Still persistent, Dan and Thomas continue discussing business, mainly to take out John Dutton. At the Yellowstone Ranch, Beth and John also come up with a plan whilst Rip enters. He informs him of the casinos that are being built with one sole purpose: destroy the Yellowstone, which leaves him stressed. Rip leaves but is stopped by Beth, who is curious as to what they were talking about. Meanwhile, the cowboys continue playing poker, unaware of the storm that's about to happen. Rip enters the barn, also with a new cowgirl, leaving them stunned, as she's a woman. Walker takes a walk, approaching Beth, telling her about the bad feeling he gets from this ranch. The same night, Casey is dropped off by Donnie, telling John about Casey's violent snap. John makes his son take a seat, having a heart-to-heart with him, and is shocked when he asks to live with him. Still up to their antics playing poker, Casey enters, leaving the cowboys surprised at his presence. Monica finally comes home, noticing Tate is sad without his father, leaving her lost with her thoughts. Jamie, agreeing to talk with Sarah, prepares to give her all the information she needs. Dan walks through the streets only to be met by the cowboys, getting him into the car. He is being pressed by them out in the middle of nowhere, making him reveal all their secrets, leaving Casey angry. They get rid of Dan once and for all, making it known who they are. In the meantime, Beth and John continue having dinner whilst she cries, exiting at the idea of her father dying. He follows her, comforting her about what needs to be done while he tries to imagine what the future has in store for the ranch. Thanks for sticking around until the end. Make sure to smash that like and subscribe button to help out the channel, and as always, have an awesome day.